Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. North Korea is continuing to stir up tensions, ramping up its missile launches and apparently restarting construction at its nuclear test site for the first time in 4 years. With South Korea's next president preparing for the inauguration and the U.S. government putting much focus on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, North Korea is trying to make the most of the situation in its pursuit of nuclear and missile programs. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Frank senior expert on Northeast Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Mr. Worked at the U.S. Department of Defense, advising defense secretaries on issues related to the Korean Peninsula. David Maxwell is also joining me today. He is senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the Combined Forces Command. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First, let's talk about the latest North Korean missile test. The test took place amid wide speculations that North Korea will soon test ICBMs. And according to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the test ended in failure as the ballistic missile exploded in midair. Mr. Do you think the U.S. government watched this closely, even though it has been dealing with the Russian attack on Ukraine for 3 weeks now?
I think, of course, the U.S. government has been watching North Korea's activities closely. It can walk and chew gum at the same time. It has excellent teams at the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, USFK, Indo-PACOM, all the intelligence agencies, and they take North Korea very seriously. Not only are they watching the threat very closely, but they're taking measures to respond to the threat, including joint missile defense exercises with South Korea and applying additional sanctions against North Korea. So I think the bigger question is whether the U.S. government will take proactive measures to change the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula rather than just calibrating their measures in response to North Korean provocations. Because if Washington is going to stay passive and cautious in its responses and let Pyongyang dictate the course of events, then it's very likely that we'll see a return to the cycle of provocations and countermeasures that we saw in 2010, 2013, and 2016 during the strategic patience approach of the Obama administration.
Well, yes, I think it's important to step back and not just consider this as a provocation or a single event. You know, we've had 10 missile launches so far this year, but we should really look and examine Kim Jong-un's strategy and his intention. And I think that he's executing his normal political warfare strategy and blackmail diplomacy in which he's trying to gain political and economic concessions through raising tensions, threats, and provocations, combined with their strategy of advancing their military capabilities, ultimately with the ultimate objective to dominate the Korean Peninsula. So you've got this political warfare strategy and you've got development of military capabilities, which are actually mutually supporting and reinforcing, and they help advance the regime's objectives. So I think we have to look at it from that perspective, and we've got to be able to, as Frank said, we've got to change and not allow the provocation cycle to continue. But we also have to realize what Kim is trying to do is drive us to make concessions, to give sanctions relief. And I think to do that, if we were to do that in some way to try to jumpstart diplomacy, it would only signal to Kim Jong-un that his political warfare strategy is successful. And rather than negotiate in good faith, he will double down on his what he perceives as successful strategy to be able to extract concessions from the United States and the international community. And we've got to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. As both of you mentioned, in response to those recent tests, the U.S. military said it intensified air defense drills in South Korea and conducted an aircraft carrier exercise in the nearby sea. And according to South Korean news reports, the U.S. ROK allies have discussed the idea of restarting the Blue Lightning drill involving nuclear-capable bombers. So does this mean both the U.S. and South Korea governments felt the need to level up the readiness, Mr. Maxwell?
Well, we've got to recover from the declining readiness due to COVID, due to the previous administration's decisions to cancel exercises. We need to conduct aggressive exercises to maintain readiness at the highest level. There must be no doubt to North Korea or to the international community that the Combined Forces Command, the ROK and U.S. military stand ready to deter North Korea and defend South Korea if North Korea chooses to attack. So we should not be using exercises to signal. Exercises are a necessary component of maintaining readiness. They should not be negotiated away, and they are a matter of routine. All militaries must train. And no one ever calls out North Korea for its winter training cycle or summer training cycle, and it is really North Korea that is demonstrating the hostile policy towards South Korea. So these exercises are welcomed and are important and very necessary for the security of South Korea.
Mr. Do you agree with what just Mr. Maxwell said about the exercises?
We do need a certain minimum level of training and readiness, but I think at what point that is and what flexibility we have to use that, to reduce tensions on the peninsula, that's for policymakers to decide. But on Blue Lightning, I want to make a note that, under the Moon administration and since the summer of 2018, the U.S. has had a de facto moratorium on bomber flights from Guam to the Korean Peninsula. And this is likely because the Moon administration wanted to try to reduce tensions on the peninsula to create a better environment for negotiations. But I think with the new Yoon administration, there's going to be a desire to adopt a more hardline approach that signals deterrence and readiness capabilities, including resuming Blue Lightning missions and returning to the large-scale nature of joint military exercise that we saw prior to 2018. I don't think this will change North Korea's behavior in any way or really increase our deterrence posture, but they do improve our training and readiness and allows us actually to put more things on the table that we can later take off during negotiations.
Apparently, North Korea started construction at its nuclear testing site, Punggye-ri, for the first time since it was closed in 2018. All these are happening at a time when South Korea has elected the opposition conservative candidate Yoon Suk-yeol as the next president. How will the dynamics change in the inter-Korean relationship during the Yoon administration?
I think the inter-Korean dynamic will become more tense and more adversarial. All the statements from the Yoon campaign indicate that the new administration will adopt a more hardline approach to North Korea that is probably going to be similar to the approaches that we saw under the previous conservative administrations of Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. I'm not saying that Yoon won't try to engage with North Korea. Certainly, Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye did, but they tried to do it on their terms, right? Similar to the strategic patience approach of the Obama administration. The problem is that North Korea has no desire to engage with these administrations on their terms, right? And not only that, when North Korea engaged in provocations to increase its leverage, Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye engaged in their responses of proactive deterrence, things like increasing its ballistic missile range, adopting a massive punishment and retaliation plan, developing preemptive kill chain strike plans, and expanding its ISR capabilities. And the end result was that other than the tail end of the six-party talks in 2008 that Lee Myung-bak basically fell into, there was no formal inter-Korean engagement during the 10-year period of the two conservative administrations from 2007 to 2017. So with North Korea not wanting to engage, most likely with a conservative ROK administration, and the US and the ROK not willing to bend over backwards to engage with North Korea, we may be entering another extended period of no engagement, punctuated by significant provocations like in 2010, 2013, and 2016.
Mr. Maxwell, what's your view?
Yeah, so I think I welcome the election of President Yoon because I think what we're going to see is a better alignment of the assumptions about the nature, the objectives and strategy of the Kim family regime between the U.S. and the ROK. And I think this is very important because, there was no success in 2018, 2019. There was no success because Kim Jong-un is not going to change his behavior. And I think that's very important that we understand that. None of these actions change his behavior. I think it's important to note that even though he has said publicly to President Moon, to former President Trump, that he intends to denuclearize, none of the policy documents inside North Korea say that they will ever denuclearize. In fact, they say the opposite. Its constitution declares it a nuclear state. There's no words in the party charter and no policy statements that have ever been issued that say that North Korea will denuclearize. And I think it's important to understand, what they will say to the administrations in the South and the U.S. is different from what their true intent is. And so we need to really understand that. So I think that the election of President Yoon is going to bring alignment with the U.S. and South Korea in policy areas. But most important, it is going to reinvigorate our defensive capabilities, which are really necessary to maintain deterrence and defense. But we must clearly understand what Kim Jong-un's intentions are. And, he is trying to drive us to concessions, yes, on his terms. But, do we really want to allow him to drive negotiations and drive the situation on his terms? I think not.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, you expected that the U.S. and South Korea will be more aligned when the Yoon administration comes into office. What are the things that it needs to be aligned more with the priority right now?
Well, as I said, it is the basic assumptions about the Kim family regime. I think the Moon administration had very different assumptions than the U.S. did. And in fact, the peace agenda was based on the assumption that Kim Jong-un wanted to negotiate in good faith, would seek peaceful unification, and would denuclearize. And I think those are false and erroneous assumptions. So I think that's one. I think we're already seeing a clear indication that there will be an alignment on military readiness, and that we will no longer use exercises as a bargaining tool because they make no sense as a bargaining tool. We must maintain military readiness, but Kim Jong-un didn't respond in 2018 to the cancellation of exercises. And in fact, his focus on exercises is not about security guarantees or his security situation. It is about driving a wedge between the ROK and U.S. alliance, about weakening defenses, about establishing the conditions in which the U.S. cannot maintain readiness. Therefore, U.S. forces cannot maintain their position on the peninsula. That is what Kim Jong-un is driving for. And I think we'll see President-elect Yoon and President Biden be aligned on those issues and not allow a weakening of our defensive posture.
Mr. Your view?
Well, first, I wanted to go back to a couple of points that Dave raised, which is, that there were no successes in 2018. There were clearly successes, right? We had the moratorium on nuclear and ballistic missile tests. It's
words
basically.
only.
Wait, if I didn't interrupt you, Dave, so please don't interrupt me. All right. There was a clear 4-year moratorium on nuclear tests, on ballistic missile tests, on long-range missile tests. That is a positive, irrefutable benefit for international security. North Korea is not conducting tests that allows them to improve their missile capabilities, right? Also, I think, we got a lot of intelligence information by meeting directly with Kim Jong-un. We have a better sense of what he's like, what his interests may be, and what they're prioritizing in terms of negotiations. I think also your point about not letting North Korea dictate the narrative. I think I absolutely agree with that. But the problem is they are dictating the narrative right now. They have nuclear weapons. They're continuing to advance their capabilities, and we're not doing anything to have them deviate from that path. So in that sense, they are dictating the narrative. Now, going to the priorities for the Biden administration, I think we need to change our strategy. Right now, its calibrated and practical approach has been ineffective in preventing North Korea from returning to its testing of ballistic missiles and potentially nuclear tests as well. I think there may be many benefits and reasons for adopting a strategy that tries to coerce North Korea using diplomatic, military, and economic pressure. But like I said before, the ultimate metric for gauging effectiveness has to be whether it's changing Pyongyang's behavior. And on this metric, the administration is not succeeding. So I think Washington needs to change its approach to be more creative and more willing to take diplomatic risks to get North Korea back to the table and stop its testing immediately. And if this means that the two allies have to take some unilateral gestures up front, so be it, as long as North Korea eventually reciprocates with its own confidence-building measures. To me, the bottom line is that we can't limit our goals to just deterring and containing North Korea. I think if you're talking from a military perspective, yes, that's your narrow goal, deterring and containing North Korea. But I think if you're talking from a broader strategic perspective, we need to expand our goals to also include building peace, improving confidence building measures, and enhancing our mutual understanding of each other. I think, North Korea is a nuclear weapon country for the short term, for the medium term, and likely the long term. So we need to do everything we can to understand its strategic thinking, its fears, and its interests.
Tell you frankly that you are pushing concessions. You are pushing that, and I cannot agree with that, and I can't recommend the Biden administration do that because I think it's a fantasy, and Kim Jong-un is not going to change. We got to deal with him as he really is, not as we wish it would be. And we can apply all the international relations theory, win-win scenarios, but Kim Jong-un is not changing, and we need to understand that. And I would say that the moratorium 2018 was not a success. And why was it not a success? Because they've continued to advance their program, with no let up. And so I think, it is a fig leaf success. Just saying no tests, that is not a measure of effectiveness at all. And I think we're in error to believe that. So,
in terms of success of 2018, I think we have to agree to disagree because I think there are certain things that were successful. I think in terms of concessions, I agree. I am supporting concessions. I'm not supporting unilateral upfront concessions where we don't ultimately get reciprocation from North Korea because no one wants to do that. No one wants to have this be a one-side street where, we're only conceding and they're not. But if it helps lead to reciprocal concessions on their side, we have to consider that.
The U.S. continues to stress China is vital in resolving the North Korean issue. And U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping talked on the phone. And earlier, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Chinese Politburo member Yang Jiechi met in Rome. While Russia has been the major topic between the two, do you think the U.S. side was able to persuade the Chinese to do more about North Korea?
Well, I think if our approach to China is trying to convince it to adopt our strategy, which is to do a better job of enforcing sanctions against North Korea, then I think Mr. Sullivan probably hit up against a brick wall, right? I'm not sure why the U.S. would continue this type of approach when all signs and evidence suggest that this approach would fail. We tried the same thing during the Obama administration, particularly with the THAAD deployment and other strategic assets deployments to the peninsula. We told the Chinese, hey, if you don't convince North Korea to change its behavior, then you're going to continue to see these types of a posture and activities that you might find adversarial, adverse, right? And it caused it caused China to do. Basically, they took economic retaliatory actions against South Korea, which the U.S. didn't really do anything to help alleviate, right? So I think the best way to get China to do more with regard to North Korea is to consider what Beijing has been proposing to jumpstart talks with North Korea and see which areas might align with our national security interests. This could include a parallel track discussion on peace and denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, how vital is China's role in North Korean issues, and will the U.S. be able to pressure China?
But I think that we need to be clear and understand that China is not going to make any effort to solve the security issues of the United States and South Korea. But I think China's priorities, of course, no war and no instability and collapse. They're satisfied with the current situation, and they will maintain the status quo. I don't think that China, and in fact, I think China looks at North Korea. We often think it looks at them as a problem, but it also is an opportunity to create dilemmas for the United States and for South Korea. So I don't anticipate any significant cooperation from China to try to denuclearize because that is not China's priority. So I don't think that we will see any effort. I would like to, but I don't think that we should approach it from the position where we have to concede to both North Korea and China to try to get Chinese cooperation in the fantasy goal and objective of denuclearization, because Kim Jong-un is not going to denuclearize. And I think that's apparent, and we need to understand that.
Recently, VOA has found out through commercial satellite images that North Korea started to tear down the South Korean-built facilities at the Mountain Kumgang Resort, which would be another indicator of how North Korea is viewing the engagement with the outside world right now. With 2 months left until the inauguration day for South Korea's new president, we'll have to watch closely how things will develop over the course. Mr. And Mr. Maxwell, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.